A waitress refused to serve him, but she had no idea his daughter owned the place. The morning sun streamed through the wide windows of a small diner nestled along the main street of Monterey, California. The aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft murmur of conversations. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and orders by heart. Regulars filled their usual spots, flipping through newspapers or chatting idly. It seemed like just another Tuesday morning until the soft creak of the door broke the familiar rhythm. The diner felt unusually quiet. An elderly black man, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit and polished shoes, stepped inside. He leaned lightly on a cane, his posture slightly stooped but commanding respect. His gaze swept the room briefly before he made his way to a corner booth. ASE settled into his seat. An unspoken tension rippled through the diner. It wasn't overt hostility, but a discomfort that clung to the air like static. A group of men at the counter exchanged furtive glances. A woman with a stroller paused mid-sip, lowering her coffee cup. The waitress, a blonde woman with her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, worked briskly around the room. She handed menus to a young couple, refilled coffee at another table, and jotted down an order from a man in a flannel shirt. But when her eyes landed on the elderly man, she froze. Her expression tightened, and without a word, she turned on her heel and retreated to the counter. Minutes passed. The man waited patiently, his hands resting on the edge of the table, occasionally glancing at the menu in front of him. The waitress didn't return. At neighboring tables, some patrons fidgeted uncomfortably. A middle-aged woman frowned, but quickly buried her attention in her phone. The young couple whispered to each other, stealing glances at the man before turning away. The elderly man raised his hand politely, signaling for service. The waitress glanced his way, but ignored him, instead heading to another table to refill coffee mugs. Moments later, she disappeared into the kitchen. The silence grew heavier. Some customers shifted uneasily in their seats, others pretended not to notice. Yet, no one intervened. The elderly man adjusted his glasses, picking up the menu again as though to distract himself from the mounting awkwardness. When the waitress returned, she carried a steaming plate of pancakes to a family near the window, her demeanor warm and cheerful. She crouched slightly to ask the parents if they needed anything else, her smile bright. But as she passed by the elderly man's booth, her expression hardened and her gaze darted elsewhere. At the counter, a man in his 40s leaned closer to his companion. "You see what's happening?" he murmured. His friend, wearing a baseball cap, shrugged. "Not our problem," he muttered, sipping his coffee. The man in the suit scanned the room again, his calm never wavering. Perhaps he was searching for an ally or simply trying to understand why the world could still feel so cold. A faint smile touched his lips when his eyes met the woman sitting nearby with her child. She hesitated, her lips parting as if she might say something, but then she looked away, directing her attention to the screen of her phone. Another 10 minutes passed. The man shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. He raised his hand again, this time higher, holding it there for several seconds. The waitress walked by, balancing a tray of drinks. He slowly lowered his hand, his shoulders sinking just slightly. The tension in the diner was no longer subtle. Patrons whispered behind their hands, their discomfort growing, yet no one intervened. A teenage busboy, who had been clearing tables, lingered near the kitchen door, his eyes darting to the elderly man's table. His brows knitted together as he leaned toward the waitress as she passed by. "Hey, that guy in the corner. He's been waiting a while," he said softly. "I'll get to him," she snapped, brushing past him without breaking stride. The busboy's gaze lingered on her uncertainly, but he didn't press further. Back at the booth, the elderly man leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. He wasn't causing a scene, wasn't raising his voice, but his quiet presence seemed to magnify the awkward silence surrounding him. Then, the door to the diner opened again, and everything shifted. The bell above the door jingled, its cheerful sound slicing through the heavy air. A woman in her early 30s stepped inside, her heels clicking confidently on the tiled floor. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair neatly styled, and an air of purpose that drew every eye in the room. Her gaze swept the diner until it landed on the elderly man in the corner. Her face brightened instantly, recognition and warmth blooming in her expression. "Dad," she called, her voice clear and ringing with affection. The man's face softened, his reserved demeanor melting into a wide, genuine smile. He stood, steadying himself with his cane as she approached, and they embraced tightly. The room, which had been humming with barely contained tension, grew eerily silent. Every pair of eyes was now locked on the pair. The waitress, who had been pouring coffee at another table, froze mid-pour. The carafe trembled slightly in her hand. The young woman pulled back from her father, her smile fading as she looked him over. Her expression shifted, a mix of confusion and concern crossing her face. "You haven't been served yet?" she asked, her voice sharp with incredulity. The elderly man hesitated, glancing around the room before answering softly, "Not yet." Her expression darkened. Straightening to her full height, she turned toward the waitress. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the diner like a blade. The waitress blinked, then turned toward her reluctantly, her face pale. "Yes?" she replied, her tone quieter than usual. "My father has been sitting here for nearly an hour," the young woman said, her voice calm but firm. "Why hasn't he been served?" The waitress opened her mouth, but no words came. Her gaze darted toward the kitchen, as if silently pleading for help. I was just about to get to him," she stammered, her voice trembling. The young woman's eyes narrowed. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like you were about to do anything." "It sure looks like you've been deliberately ignoring him," the young woman said, her voice cutting through the thick air of the diner. The waitress's face flushed a deep red. She fumbled for words, her hands gripping the coffee pot tightly. "It's been busy." "I didn't mean to. Don't lie to me," the young woman interrupted, raising a hand to silence her. Everyone in this room saw what happened. You had no problem serving every other table. A ripple of murmurs broke out among the patrons. Some nodded subtly, their earlier unease shifting into quiet agreement. The tension, once merely discomfort, had transformed into something heavier, accountability. The young woman turned back to her father, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, her voice laced with regret. "You shouldn't have had to deal with this." The elderly man smiled gently and patted her hand. "It's all right," he replied, though the quiet hurt in his eyes betrayed his words. But his daughter wasn't finished. She straightened and turned back to the waitress, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Let me make one thing clear," she began, her voice carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest whispers in the room. "That man you ignored for the past hour. He's not just a customer. He's my father. And I own this restaurant." The room froze. Every head swiveled toward the waitress, whose face had drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The weight of the revelation pressed down on everyone in the diner, suffocating the space. You own the place," the waitress finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "That's right," the young woman said, her tone unwavering. "I've poured my heart into this business. I built it to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of who they are. And today, you disrespected not only my father, but everything this restaurant stands for." The waitress took a shaky step back, clutching the coffee pot as if it could somehow steady her. "I didn't mean to. She trailed off, her excuses sounding hollow even to her own ears. "You just what?" The young woman pressed, her voice rising slightly. Thought you could decide who deserves respect and who doesn't. Thought no one would notice? She gestured broadly to the room. Well, everyone noticed. The patrons sat in stunned silence. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others exchanged guilty looks, recalling how they had chosen to stay quiet. The young woman's gaze swept across the room, landing on each table in turn. And to the rest of you, she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm, why didn't anyone say anything? Why did you all sit here and let this happen? A man at the counter cleared his throat awkwardly. I didn't want to get involved, he muttered, staring down at his coffee cup. The young woman's eyes narrowed. Silence is complicity, she said. When you see something wrong and say nothing, you're part of the problem. Her words lingered in the air, sharp and unrelenting. The diner seemed to shrink under the weight of her conviction. The elderly man reached out, placing a hand on his daughter's arm. His touch was gentle, steadying. Let it go, sweetheart, he said softly. They've heard enough. She turned to him, her shoulders dropping slightly. He smiled, the warmth in his expression soothing the fire in her gaze. Together they sat down, the weight of the moment settling over the diner like an unspoken promise that things would never be the same. She turned to him, her expression softening once more. Dad, you deserve better. This shouldn't have happened. He smiled, a quiet strength in his eyes. I know, but the lesson has been learned. The waitress, now visibly shaking, stammered, I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. Please, I'll do better. The young woman stared at her for a long moment before nodding curtly. You'll have the chance to prove it, but if I see anything like this again, you're done. The room was silent, heavy with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. But the lesson was far from over. The young woman stepped back and glanced around the room, her gaze steady. This restaurant was built on the values of kindness and respect, she said, addressing everyone. Not just because it's good for business, but because it's the right thing to do. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity, no exceptions. The waitress nodded vigorously, her cheeks flushed with shame. I promise I'll make it right. I'll apologize to him properly. You'll do more than that, the young woman replied. You'll reflect on why you acted the way you did today and make sure it never happens again. I'm giving you this chance because I believe people can change, but it's up to you to prove it. The waitress swallowed hard and nodded again. I understand. Thank you. The young woman turned back to her father, her expression softening once more. Let's get you that breakfast you came here for. But her father shook his head with a quiet chuckle. I think I've lost my appetite for eggs and bacon. Let's go home, sweetheart. The patrons, who had remained silent for so long, began to stir. A woman from the far corner stood up hesitantly. Ma'am, she said, her voice timid. I want to apologize. I saw what was happening, and I should have spoken up. It wasn't right to just sit and watch. The elderly man smiled warmly at her. Acknowledging it now is a start, he said. The next time you see something, don't hesitate. Speak up. You might make all the difference. A few others began murmuring their agreements, their faces lined with guilt and a newfound resolve. The tension that had gripped the room was beginning to lift, replaced by an air of reflection. The young woman took her father's arm and led him toward the door. As they passed the waitress, she stopped and spoke quietly but firmly. I expect better from you, for everyone's sake. Yes, ma'am, the waitress replied, her head bowed. As the father and daughter exited the diner, the sunlight outside seemed a little brighter. The elderly man paused, leaning on his cane, and looked at his daughter with pride. You've become a remarkable woman, he said. She smiled back at him. I learned from the best. Inside the diner, the staff and patrons were left to reflect, their usual morning routines disrupted by something far more important, a lesson about compassion, courage, and the power of doing what's right. The father and daughter walked down the bustling street together, their steps in sync. As they moved away from the diner, the elderly man paused, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "sometimes it takes a moment like this to remind people what really matters." His daughter nodded. "You're right, Dad. People need to be reminded that their actions or their silence can have consequences. If no one speaks up, nothing changes." The elderly man smiled, his expression filled with quiet wisdom. "And you've done your part today, not just for me, but for everyone in that room." The two continued their walk, their bond stronger than ever, leaving behind a powerful example of standing up for what's right. Inside the diner, the lesson lingered, inspiring some to rethink their choices and others to resolve to do better in the future. What would you have done in that diner? Would you have spoken up? This story is a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's also a call to action for all of us. When you see something wrong, don't stay silent. Speak up. Take a stand. Your voice might be the one that changes everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and action. Let's make a difference together, one story at a time.